A luxury SUV, a successful surgeon, a routine afternoon. But within minutes, everything spiraled into a nightmare no one saw coming. Handcuffs, accusations, humiliation, a career built on saving lives shattered by one officer's blind assumptions. What started as a simple search for an ID became a confrontation, exposing power, prejudice, and a system stacked against the innocent. Stay with us as we uncover a story where truth fights back, and justice demands far more than apologies. The afternoon sun beat down on the parking lot outside Riverside Medical Plaza, the kind of quiet, well-kept place where most people expected nothing out of the ordinary. Dr. Alicia Westbrook, a well-known trauma surgeon, stood beside her silver Tesla Model X, her brow furrowed in frustration. She wasn't in her scrubs today, just jeans and a simple blouse, which probably made her blend in more than stand out. With her phone buzzing constantly, Alicia knew her surgical team was waiting. But without her hospital ID badge, she couldn't even get through the staff entrance. It had to be in her gym bag, probably buried her workout clothes, or yesterday's receipt. She leaned into the back seat, muttering to herself, her hands sifting through every pocket and compartment. A low rumble drew her attention. A police cruiser rolled into the lot, slowing near her car. Alicia straightened, the weight of years of professional success clashing with the instant, familiar dread that settled it in her chest. She knew even before the officer opened his door, this wasn't going to go well. The police cruiser slowed to a crawl, its tires crunching softly over the sun-baked asphalt. From the corner of her eye, Dr. Alicia Westbrook could see the officer watching her. The sensation was waif and familiar, the kind of attention she had felt since she was a teenager, long before her M or the letters after her name mattered to anyone. She took a deep breath and turned toward him, offering a polite but strained smile. Before she could say a word, the officer, Sergeant Brent Callahan, was already climbing out of his cruiser, his heavy boots planting firmly on the pavement like he was preparing for trouble. "You got a reason for digging through that car, ma'am?" Callahan asked, his voice hard, suspicious. There was no greeting, no afternoon, ma'am. Just a question delivered like an accusation. Alicia held up her hands slightly, trying to ease the tension she could already feel building. "It's my car," she said evenly. "I'm a surgeon over at St. Matthew's. I left my ID in my gym bag, and I'm running late for a surgery." Callahan's eyes narrowed, taking in her casual clothes, her black skin, and the sleek Tesla. His mouth twisted into something between a smirk and a sneer. "A surgeon, huh?" he said, the disbelief dripping off every word. "Yes, sir," Alicia replied, keeping her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her ears. "Do you have any ID on you right now?" She shook her head. "That's what I'm looking for." Callahan's hand rested on his belt, just a few inches from his holster. "Step away from the car, ma'am. Let's figure out what's really going on here." Alicia's stomach tightened. This was already going south. Dr. Alicia Westbrook took a careful step back from her Tesla, her hands raised slightly, palms open, trying to show Sergeant Callahan that she wasn't a threat. Years of working in high-pressure operating ORIM had trained her to stay calm under stress. But this was different. This wasn't about skill or training. This was about how he saw her, not who she actually was. "Sergeant, if you'll let me open the back door, I can show you my hospital bag," Alicia said, her voice controlled but tight. "My ID badge is inside." Callahan shook his head, taking another step forward, his hand still resting on his belt. "Not how this works," he said flatly. "Step all the way back." Alicia knew there was no reasoning with him. Not now. His mind was already made up. Still, she tried. "This is my car," she said again, this time slower, as if the words themselves might pierce the wall of suspicion between them. "I'm a surgeon. I can call the hospital right now and—" "Hands behind your back." The order hit her like a slap. "Excuse me, you heard me." The click of the handcuffs rang out louder than the distant hum of traffic. Cold metal snapped tight around her wrists, and Alicia couldn't stop the jolt of disbelief that shot through her. She had spent her whole life proving herself through medical school, residency, every night shift, every emergency surgery. None of it mattered. Not to him. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for suspicion of attempted vehicle theft," Callahan said. His tone almost casual, like this was just another box to check on his afternoon patrol. Alicia turned her head slightly, catching the reflection of her own face in the car window. Jaw tight, eyes burning with frustration. She refused to let spill over. A few people in the lot had stopped to watch. None of them said a word. As Callahan led her toward the cruiser, Alicia knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every professional, every black American who had ever been told they didn't belong. This was far, far over. The ride to the Westbrook police precinct was silent, except for the crackle of the police radio and the hum of the air conditioning. Dr. Alicia Westbrook sat in the back seat, wrists stiff from the too tight handcuffs, her fingers tingling as blood struggled to flow. She stared straight ahead, her face calm, but inside the storm was building. She wasn't new to pressure. She'd guided trauma teams through chaos, making life or death decisions in seconds. But this wasn't the kind of pressure you could train for. This was the weight of being judged before you're even heard, of knowing your title, your education, your spotless record meant nothing the moment someone like Sergeant Callahan decided who you were. When they pulled into the precinct lot, Callahan didn't say a word. He opened the door, grabbed her arm, and led her inside like she was some career criminal. The front desk officer barely looked up. Processing a suspect was just part of the day, no different from stamping forms or grabbing coffee. Alicia was fingerprinted, her mugshot taken under the harsh fluorescent lights, her gold hoop earrings and pressed blouse out of place among the usual suspects. The younger officer who took her photo, Officer Matt Ramirez, looked uncomfortable, like he knew something wasn't right, but didn't dare say so. "You sure you got this one right, Sarge?" Ramirez asked quietly, avoiding Alicia's eye. "Trust me," Callahan replied, voice dripping with confidence. "I know the type." Alicia clenched her jaw, biting down her words. She knew better than to argue with men like him. Men who couldn't be convinced because they didn't want to be. She was led to a holding cell, its cold metal bench barely wide enough to sit on. The walls were painted that dull institutional beige, the color of indifference. Hours passed. No one came to check on her. No one asked her side of the story. When Alicia finally asked for her phone call, Callahan leaned against the bars, smirking. "Go ahead," he said. "Call whoever you want." It won't change a thing, but Alicia knew better. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was about every black professional who'd been second-guessed, dismissed and humiliated for no reason at all, and she wasn't about to let it slide. The cold bench pressed into Dr. Alicia Westbrook's back, her fingers rubbing at the red marks left by the handcuffs. The air inside the holding cell was stale, the kind of air that settled in places where people were held, judged, and forgotten. Hours ticked by, her frustration tempered only by the certainty that someone would come for her. That someone was Ethan Chambers, her longtime friend and one of the sharpest civil rights attorneys in the state. When Alicia made her single phone call, she knew exactly who to reach. And Ethan wasted no time. The double doors of the precinct lobby swung open, and in walked Ethan, his grey suit crisp, shoes polished, and his briefcase swinging with purpose. Every step echoed off the linoleum floor, and for the first time since her arrest, Alicia felt the balance shift. "Dr. Westbrook," Ethan called, his voice carrying through the front desk area like a gavel striking wood. "Are you all right?" Before Alicia could respond, Sergeant Callahan appeared, his arms crossed over his chest, the same smug smirk plastered on his face. "She's fine," Callahan said. "We caught her trying to break into a car. Probably saved someone a lot of trouble." Ethan's smile was tight, the kind he reserved for depositions where he was about to dismantle someone. "That's funny," Ethan said, setting his briefcase down on the desk, "because that car is registered to Dr. Alicia Westbrook, Chief of Trauma Surgery at St. Matthew's Hospital. A fact you would have known if you'd bothered to check her plates." Callahan's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "Look, people lie all the time," he said. "I've got procedures to follow." Ethan stepped closer, his voice lowering to a knife's edge. "No, what you have is a mess, and if you think I'm letting this go, you're sorely mistaken." The desk sergeant, sensing the shift, picked up the phone to call the precinct captain. Alicia sat straighter, her hands folded in her lap. This was the moment where the fight turned, when the weight of her reputation, her work, and her truth started to push back, and she knew, with Ethan beside her, they were just getting started. It took less than 10 minutes for Captain Linda Henshaw to arrive, her low heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Her silver hair was pulled back into a tight bun, her badge pinned perfectly on the fee. She wasn't the kind of captain who enjoyed surprises, and from the moment she stepped into the room, It was clear she sensed this was going to be a mess. Ethan Chambers turned toward her the second she entered. "Captain Henshaw, I assume you're aware that your officers arrested Dr. Alicia Westbrook, a respected trauma surgeon, on suspicion of stealing her car," he said, voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the tension. The captain's brow furrowed as she glanced at Alicia, still sitting quietly in the holding area. Recognition flickered in her eyes. She'd seen Alicia before, on the news, at charity events, even at a community health fair the department sponsored last year. "Dr. Westbrook," Henshaw said, her voice measured, but respectful. "Let me get to the bottom of this." Alicia gave a small nod, her face calm, but her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "Sergeant Callahan," Henshaw said, turning her attention to him. "Walk me through exactly why Dr. Westbrook is sitting in that cell." Callahan squared his shoulders. She was acting suspicious, digging through a car. No ID, couldn't prove anything. "I followed procedure." Ethan's chuckle was low and humorless. "No, you profiled her. You skipped basic steps like running the license plate, checking her registration, or simply asking better questions." Captain Henshaw's gaze darkened. "Did you run the plates, Sergeant?" Callahan shifted uncomfortably. "I was going to." "You didn't," Henshaw interrupted. "That's negligence, and you know it." Alicia watched the exchange, her pulse steadying for the first time since the cuffs snapped around her wrists. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but cracks were forming. Captain Henshaw turned to the desk sergeant. "Run the plates right now." Within moments the truth was in black and white on the screen. The Tesla belonged to Dr. Alicia Westbrook. The weight of Callahan's mistake hung in the room, thick as smoke. Alicia exhaled slowly, knowing the fight was shifting in her favor. The silence that filled the precinct after the license plate check was almost heavier than the heat hanging outside. Alicia Westbrook's name, address, and hospital affiliation were all right there on the screen. Undeniable proof that the car was hers, and that Sergeant Callahan had made a catastrophic mistake. Captain Linda Henshaw stood with her arms crossed, her expression carved from stone. She turned toward Callahan, her voice low and controlled. "You had every tool at your disposal to verify her identity, and you ignored every one of them." Callahan's jaw tightened, but the usual bravado wasn't there. He knew better than to mouth off to the captain, but the resentment burning behind his eyes was plain as day. Ethan Chambers stepped up beside Alicia, his presence a quiet anchor. "I want this documented," he said firmly. "Every skipped step, every decision Sergeant Callahan made. I expect a full record and a formal apology." Captain Henshaw nodded. "You'll get both." She walked to the holding cell herself, unlocking the door with a heavy clank. "Dr. Westbrook, I am truly sorry for the treatment you received here today," Henshaw said, her voice softer now. "We failed you, and we will address this." Alicia stepped out slowly, rubbing her wrists where the cuffs had left faint red marks. She didn't respond right away, not because she didn't have words, but because there were too many. Apologies were fine, but they were patches on a broken system. "Thank you," Alicia said finally, her tone even. "But this isn't just about me." Henshaw's brow lifted slightly. "What do you mean?" Alicia's gaze cut toward Callahan, then back to the captain. "I'm not the only person this has happened to. I'm just one of the few who had the resources to fight it." Ethan nodded. "We'll be filing a formal complaint and pushing for a full investigation. Not just into this incident, but into the department's handling of racial profiling complaints." The captain's jaw clenched slightly, but she nodded. "Understood." Alicia stood taller, her voice steady. "This doesn't end with me walking out of here. This is the start of something bigger." And as she and Ethan walked out into the sunlight, Alicia knew the fight for justice didn't end at the precinct door. It was only beginning. The conference room at Westbrook Police Precinct was eerily. The blinds were half drawn, letting in just enough morning sunlight to remind everyone that a new day had begun, though not for Sergeant Brent Callahan. At the long, scratched-up table sat Dr. Alicia Westbrook, her posture straight, her expression calm but unreadable. Beside her, Ethan Chambers leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes locked on a stack of paperwork. Captain Linda Henshaw held in her hand. Across from them sat Callahan, arms crossed tight across his chest, shoulders squared like a man who still believed he could muscle his way through the truth. But the flicker of doubt in his eyes gave him away. He knew exactly why they were all here. Captain Henshaw cleared her throat. Sergeant Callahan, the internal review is complete. Based on body cam footage, your arrest report, and your refusal to follow established protocols, it's the determination of this department that you engaged in racial profiling and violated multiple department policies. Callahan's jaw clenched so tight, Alicia could almost hear his teeth grinding. Effective immediately, Henshaw continued, her voice firm, you are terminated from your position with the Westbrook Police Department. Callahan shoved back his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. This is bull, he muttered, glaring at Alicia. All this over some rich doctor crying about getting her feelings hurt. Ethan leaned forward, his tone low and deadly calm. This is about the Constitution, Sergeant. About rights you swore to protect. Instead, you chose to violate them. Alicia didn't flinch under Callahan's glare. Instead, she met his eyes head-on, her voice even. You didn't arrest a criminal, you arrested your own assumption. And now you're paying the price for it. Callahan's face flushed red, but he said nothing. There was no excuse left to hide behind. No shield strong enough to protect him from the consequences of his own choices. He stomped out without another word, leaving Alicia and Ethan sitting in the stillness. It's a start, Alicia said quietly. But it's not enough. Ethan nodded. That's why we're not done. Alicia took a slow breath. Today, one officer was held accountable. Tomorrow, the whole system had to answer. The sun was high by the time Dr. Alicia Westbrook and Ethan Chambers walked out of the Westbrook Police Precinct. The air was thick with humidity, the kind of southern heat that clung to your skin. But for Alicia, the weight she carried was heavier than the weather. They stood by her Tesla, the same car that had sparked the entire ordeal, its silver paint gleaming in the sunlight. Ethan leaned against the hood, hands in his pockets, studying Alicia's face. One officer fired. Ethan said quietly, it's something, not everything, but something. Alicia nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the faint red marks still visible on her wrists. It's not enough, she said. Not even close. They both knew the truth. Sergeant Callahan was a symptom, not the disease. There would always be another Callahan, another officer who saw skin color before credentials, who reached for cuffs before the truth. One termination wouldn't change that. That's why, before they left the precinct, Alicia had accepted Captain Henshaw's offer to join the Community Oversight Board, a civilian panel designed to review complaints, monitor department practices, and recommend policy changes. It was supposed to be a bridge between the police and the people they served. Alicia didn't trust it yet, but she was willing to make it mean something. I want that first meeting on the books this week, Alicia said, pulling her phone from her bag. And it's not just going to be me in that room. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What do you have in mind? Voices, Alicia said. People who've been through this. People who didn't have a lawyer like you or a title like mine. I want them at the table. If the department's serious about change, they need to hear from the people they ignore. Ethan smiled faintly. That's why I love working with you. You don't just fight for yourself. You fight for everybody. Alicia exhaled slowly, staring out at the street. If it's just about me, nothing changes. Together they drove off. But Alicia wasn't leaving the fight behind. She was bringing it with her. And this time she wasn't coming alone. A week later, Dr. Alicia Westbrook stood at the window of her office, looking out over the city skyline. Life at the hospital had returned to normal. Patients, surgeries, rounds. But inside her, something had shifted. The bruises on her wrists were fading, but the memory hadn't. Each time she washed her hands before surgery, she saw them in the mirror, a reminder of how quickly dignity could be stripped away. The first Community Oversight Board meeting was already scheduled. Alicia wasn't going just as a surgeon, or even as a wrongfully arrested woman. She was going as a voice for every person whose story ended quietly, with no lawyer, no headlines, and no justice. One officer was gone, but the system that created him still stood. Alicia knew change wouldn't come overnight, but she also knew this. She wasn't stepping away from the fight. She was stepping deeper in. The story of Dr. Alicia Westbrook isn't just fiction. It's a reflection of what can happen in real life to anyone, regardless of title or success. It's a reminder that dignity should never depend on appearances, and that assumptions, whether by law enforcement, neighbors, or strangers, can destroy lives in an instant. We all have a role to play in demanding fairness, holding systems accountable, and standing up for the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Whether you faced injustice yourself or want to help build a world where your children and grandchildren are treated with respect, these stories matter. If you believe in the power of truth, fairness, and justice, subscribe to this channel for more stories that expose reality, inspire change, and remind us that the fight for equality isn't over, and together we can make a difference. Hit that subscribe button and stay informed.